Buenos días, bienvenidos al webinar de Engage Innovate, donde tendremos el gusto de presentar a Christian Rangen, que nos estará hablando de la transformación estratégica. Hi Chris, how are you?
Hello and good morning.
Good morning. Vamos a hacer una introducción en español, luego presentaremos a Christian, quien nos estará presentando sus apreciaciones sobre el tema de transformación estratégica. La llamada será en inglés, el webinar será en inglés. Cualquier pregunta, por favor, no duden en hacérnosla. Así que bienvenidos a todos. Pueden hacer las preguntas a lo largo del webinar. Vamos a responderlas al final del mismo y haremos el esfuerzo de responder todas las preguntas que se presenten. Mi nombre es Roberto Chaverri, yo voy a ser el host del día de hoy. Soy el director de Engage Innovate para Latinoamérica y como les mencionaba, tenemos el honor de tener a Christian Rangen, nuestro CEO y CEO de Strategy Tools, como conferencista invitado. Christian es un experto mundial en estrategia, en innovación y transformación, que es de lo que vamos a estar hablando hoy, y de manera muy importante también sobre diseño de ecosistemas y superclusters de innovación, que vamos a conocer cómo son parte de los elementos fundamentales para una transformación estratégica. Como mencionaba, es el fundador y CEO de Engage Innovate y Strategy Tools, profesor de estrategia, emprendimiento y programas de educación ejecutiva en BI Norwegian Business Schools, también invitado en diferentes universidades alrededor del mundo, y es un autor prolífico de publicaciones importantes, incluyendo The Shifting Energy Arena, Building Switzerland's Innovation Supercluster, Innovation Superclusters, A New Playbook for Economic Growth, y muy importante, el próximo reporte que saldrá en unos días, el 10 de marzo, Building the Transformational Company, donde estaremos cubriendo en detalle los puntos que vamos a estar conversando el día de hoy. Así que sin más preámbulo, Chris, I'm going to introduce you to the audience. Most of the people is connecting from Costa Rica, where there is a growing interest in this topic. So I will let you go over for the following minutes the presentation and get your perspective on why it's so important for companies today, especially incumbent companies, to drive and structure and successfully lead strategic transformation efforts. So we're in your hands.
Thank you very much, Roberto, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's really my pleasure to join you from a cold and enjoyable morning or afternoon here in Norway. So I will be sharing my screen. Does that work okay?
Yeah, perfectly.
Wonderful, wonderful. So what I would like to do is I'll go through some concepts, I'll go through some examples, I'll go through some slides, but I really encourage you to ask questions. I'll try to take any questions during the webinar, but also we have time towards the end of the webinar for any questions or any discussion. So whenever you're interested, what I will be speaking about is what we call an emerging or a new paradigm on strategy. And I hope you find it interesting. I hope you find it useful. And most importantly, I hope that you find it valuable enough that you may want to learn more about it. And I'll share as much as I can during the time that we have together today. I want to start, if you will, with a reference. It's really important to recognize the classics and the current school of thought in strategy, and I'm sure that many of you have read or heard of, and some of you have maybe even had a chance to meet Professor Michael Porter at Harvard. And what Porter and many like him did in the 70s and early 80s was basically define a strategy as we understand it today. Things like the BCG matrix, 1964, things like the value chain, 1979, the 5 forces on competitive strategy, 1984. So those classic pieces, they've been around for a while, and we are very respectful of them. But it's also a fact that the classic pieces that we have in strategy are not really applicable. They're not bad, but they're maybe not as sharp or maybe as relevant as they used to be. And there are many reasons for that. Top strategy thinker and a good friend of ours, Rita McGrath, she has a phrase which says we're working with outdated tools, but also very importantly, in our minds, outdated assumptions about what is strategy and how does strategy work. And that's what I want to sort of share with you today. I want to ask you a question, and I need your help. I need your input. What do you see here? This is a 5-year timeline. What do you see here? Roberto, maybe I'll use you as my local guide, and you can answer this in Spanish. I'll practice. What do you see here?
Vemos un crecimiento muy alto por parte de una de las gráficas y un crecimiento y decrecimiento por parte de los otros dos jugadores.
So my Spanish is okay, but that was just too much for me. No, but you're right. This is the 5-year development of the share price. These are 3 energy companies. There are 3 energy companies that used to be quite similar. This is really important. They used to be quite similar. They used to be grouped in the same category. They used to be looked upon as what we call industry peers. So companies doing similar to us. And they were recognized as equally pretty valuable companies. And as you can see in the share price, 15, 16 for 2 companies, and then 1 company came back to the stock exchange. Late 16, 17, something happened around the beginning of 2018. And then you can sort of see as we're getting towards the end of 2018 that they started diverging significantly. And what you're seeing today is actually this ongoing shift in the energy space. So the blue at the bottom here, which is down 41% over 5 years, is Exxon, the American oil and gas company. It's a big company, lots of assets, lots of talent, lots of technology, but it's still down 41% over 5 years. The one in the middle is what we call an ongoing transformation case. This is Equinor, which is the Norwegian government-ish oil and gas company that is now transforming into a wide energy company. And the orange one is interesting because that is a Danish company that used to be oil and gas and it used to be coal, but they sold off all of those assets and said, we want to transform into the world's leading clean energy company. That should be something for Costa Rica. And as you can see, they are up about 184%, with most of that gain coming in the last year and a half. This is what transformation looks like. This is what happens when you're not able to transform. This is what happens when you're in the middle of a transformation journey. And this is what happens when you come out, hopefully quite successfully. And the question that's being asked now is no longer can Ørsted, the Danish energy company that used to be oil and gas and it used to be coal, it's no longer a question of can they transform. It's really a question, can they become what we call a green energy superpower and the world's first green energy super major. So they are so advanced that the entire narrative, the story, the media, the financial analysts, all of that has shifted from can they transform to, hey, wait a minute, they've already jumped in quite successfully. Can they now become a massively different and very valuable green energy super major? And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is what transformation looks like. And that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So in the field of strategy, about, say, 30 years ago, there was a couple of assumptions that strategy was a pretty stable exercise. You would define your industry, you would define your industry space, you would define your customers, you would define your partners, and you would assume a certain level and very often a pretty high level of stability. That is no longer the case. What we're seeing now is that this urgent need to change and adapt is much more frequent, much more aggressive. And if you don't do it well, or even worse, if you don't do it at all, your time as a big company can be over quite quickly. I'll show you a few examples of that. So the definition is, this is the definition that we write about in the upcoming report that Roberto was kind enough to show, is that transformation is a significant, lasting, and non-reversible change to the company's value creation logic. So it's no longer enough to just add a few more products, to add some services on top, to come up with a few business models. It's no longer enough to do what we call a small digital project and call it a digital transformation. It is a significant, non-reversible change to how the company actually creates value for its customers, for its partners, for its investors, and also, importantly, for its employees. And what we find in our research, which is published in the report, is that there are three types of transformation. I'll spend a few minutes on this with you. The first type of transformation is shock. And we have shift and evolution. And every single company that we look at, everyone can be put in one of those categories, in one of these three types. The first category that we call shock is, this is what happens when management hasn't been paying attention. This is what happens when management see Apple put out their first phone and they laugh at it. They said, yeah, what does Apple know about making phones anyway? Why should we care? We are Nokia. We are the biggest phone manufacturer in the world, and there's no one that can touch us. And that was the dominant paradigm. That was the mindset. And then it only took a few years before Nokia realized, like, oh wow, we are in deep, serious trouble. That's shock. The second, shift, that is something very different, and there aren't many cases available of those shifts. Shift is what happens when management, very often in a strategic review, realize, wait a minute, the world has changed so much, and we need to get ahead of this change. We need to aggressively, consciously change direction, almost 90 degrees overnight, where we need to sell off or close down the old core business, and we need to jump into this future that is very uncertain, it's very challenging, it's very difficult, but we need to do that to be successful. And there's a wonderful case on that in Adobe, which I'm sure many of us use today, where of course they used to sell software in a box, and they effectively shifted overnight into the cloud. And it's a really powerful learning for many companies of how were they able to? Well, they had bold leadership. They engaged with outside partners, and they realized the inevitable shift that was happening. And then they said that we need to get in front of this, not be left behind it. And finally, and this is really the dream case, if you will, is what we call evolution. Evolution has been really interesting. We find many examples of evolution. But evolution is a long term, so it typically takes about 10 years. Slowly, gradually, and then boom. But it's a pretty planned and also very well executed process, where a lot of the keys is not so much digital and it's not so much culture, although those may be important, but it's really the resource allocation of how the company invests money in new areas. So we've been digging into this. And I'm sure that many of you know these examples. I mean, Kodak, Blockbuster, Nokia, these are wonderful examples of effectively shock. In each of them, including Sears and Toys R Us more recently, you can find management that says the future is going to be great. The market outlook is fantastic. We're going to do so good. And then almost overnight. And next for Shift, we see some really good examples. Shift, Evolution, Microsoft is a wonderful case, and we're working on a very large sort of insight case studies on Microsoft. Philips in the Netherlands is a good case. Fujifilm from Japan is probably a well-known case that is not as well-known as they deserve to be, because it's a really good case. Fuji could easily have chosen the same fate as Kodak, but they didn't. But what we find really interesting is what we call ongoing cases of transformation. And one of the things I want to share with you today is such an ongoing case from a company called Volkswagen. So I'll be using Volkswagen as an example throughout this webinar. And I hope that you will see with me that there are many interesting things happening in Volkswagen that may also be applicable to your companies, whatever industry, whatever space you may be in. One of the reasons why I think Volkswagen is so interesting is it's a big company that is important to so many stakeholders. So it's not just that it's a big company in terms of making cars, but it's a big company that has a very extensive supply chain. They have around 400, maybe 800,000 people working in the supply chain, maybe more if you count sort of the suppliers to the suppliers. They have a really important role in being a national company for Germany and a regional company for the south of Germany. And they are very dominant. So they fit many of the pieces for a high risk, fall on your face shock company. They recently got a new CEO. And whenever new CEOs come in, they do tend to shake up things more than traditional CEOs do. And the new CEO, Mr. Herbert Diess, he's been actually walking around saying, this is our Nokia moment. We, Volkswagen, need to recognize, and the partners we work with, the investors we work with, the stakeholders we work with the employees we work with, we need to recognize that this is our Nokia moment, that this is our burning platform. And his phrase is that we now need to slaughter the sacred cows, kill off cars, kill off factories, kill off employment groups, or even entire business units to be able to handle this shift that is going on. And that shift that's going on is something we're going to be looking at in this webinar. Interestingly, the new CEO has been asking this, and he's framing it as a question. I think that's worth noticing for many of us. He's framing it as a question: are we well enough prepared for what's coming? And what's coming? Well, a recent study by Accenture said that about 71% of all big companies face or are going to shortly face a significant level of disruption in their industry space. Now, that is largely driven by digital disruption, but it can also be business model disruption, technology disruption. It can be disruption caused by unfortunate viruses and diseases. But these disruptions are now coming more frequent and very often also more aggressively than they did in the past. So in our report that I hope to be able to share with you, we see a few things. We see that transformation is becoming the new normal. And this is going to really force us to rethink how we build and operate companies globally. Companies will need to build new skills, new capabilities, new ways of working. And this transformation is probably the biggest leadership challenge that we have. It deeply goes into the heart of any company. It goes into the culture, it goes into the identity, it goes into the soul. It affects maybe up to 60-70% of your employees. It affects established dominant mindsets. It affects established business models. It is an incredibly difficult job to successfully lead this kind of transformation. Now, the big question is, so how do we do this? We understand the world is changing. We see some of these signs. Some of you may be working in consumer goods. Some of you may be working in consulting or professional services. Lots of disruption going on. Some of you may be working in tourism. Some of you may be working in energy. Some of you may be working in industrial conglomerates or even family businesses. And what we find that we publish in the report is that there's a pattern. You have to do what's called managing your existing business and develop your new business at the same time. Now that sounds really easy, but when we dig into it, it's a little bit more difficult than that. And to help companies understand that, we've developed several tools, several methodologies, and several frameworks that I'd like to share with you. One is what we call 2 lenses on strategy. And 2 lenses on strategy is very simple, very visual setup. It says you have a traditional, pretty dominant view of strategy, where strategy is built on the Michael Porter school of thinking that I showed you in the opening. And strategy is primarily an analytical exercise with rational actors. And the underlying assumption is very much that, the future is going to be quite like the present. We don't really plan for a lot of change. We don't expect a lot of change. Yeah, of course, some change, but maybe not that much. And at a business model level, we really have one business model and we should defend it at all costs. Yeah, we can tune it, but come on, we are not really business model innovators per se. And this is really the traditional. And Roberto, I want to ask you a question. I know you've worked with this in many different settings. What has been your observation on how many companies are maybe stuck in this strategy as analysis versus strategy as innovation? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. We see that a lot of companies are thinking of new approaches when discussing innovation, but really when they are addressing their strategic challenges or strategic dilemmas, they still continue to go through the typical and traditional tools, and it's always quite amazing how every company always started with a SWOT analysis, for example.
Okay. And like you said, there's nothing wrong in a SWOT analysis, but if that's all we do, it's probably not sufficient. And what I'd like to point you towards is this side. This is what we call strategy as innovation. Now, it is fundamentally different, and I can't emphasize this enough. It is fundamentally different because the mindset, the thinking of the participants is much more creative, much more disruptive, much more explorative, much more forward-leaning. And what's really interesting when I work with these kind of executives is the ambitions are so much more offensive and positively aggressive, much more competitive than the other group. And when I talk to this group, and when I get a chance to interview them and work with them very close, what I find is that they have an underlying assumption about the future, and that is we believe deeply that the future is going to be very different. So when we look at our market, we look at our landscape, we look at our ecosystem, we look at our regulatory environment, we look at the financial community, we believe that the landscape is changing so much that we don't know what it's going to look like. But that's okay, because we are positively leaning in. We're developing a portfolio of many different potential business models, and we really thrive on that change. We love that change. We believe that we can be some of the leading ones in this new marketplace, whatever that may look. Now, for those of you that enjoy some reading, you may have read about this in the books by Gary Hamel or Rita McGrath, Clay Christensen, which just passed. But there's a lot of thinkers increasingly pushing us towards strategy as innovation. And that's really the thing right now with Volkswagen as well, because they can choose to focus really hard on the core business. They can choose to focus really hard on the traditional perspective. But they're also, and it's not either or, but it's and also trying to get into what we call the future business opportunities, where the car is no longer a car, the car is going to be a mobile device. The culture we change and the culture we need to create is going to be so much different. And we actually need to aggressively lean in and just charge ahead without having all the answers. We need what Volkswagen calls revolutionary business model innovation, which is very, very curious for a large industrial German company. What I find in my work with CEOs is that many of them would use this phrase. They will use in different ways a phrase that says the landscape is shifting faster. Our markets, our competitors, our digital entrants, Alibaba, Amazon, the pace of business is so much faster, and we need to approach it differently. And there are many good analysis that shows this and basically documents this. One of my favorites is our friends Innovate in US and Singapore, that effectively says that the lifetime of big companies is just exploding. It's a boom going down. You cannot be a big company and lean on the fact, rest on the fact you have attained a dominant market position. You really need, in the words of Insight, to reinvent yourself, or in the words of us, to learn how to transform and transform through evolution, not through sudden shocks. And this is really important, like Roberto mentioned in the introduction. We're really seeing a blurring of lines between traditional industries and what is now called arenas. And this is a really interesting concept. It's a concept first developed by our good friend William McGrath and now expanded upon by many others. But it basically means that the competitors you're going to face in the future is not going to come from your traditional industry. You're going to face different, better funded, more aggressive, most likely more innovative competitors that come from outside your industry, or actually reshape your industry and redraw the boundaries of how your industry works. I think we're seeing this more and more in some of the largest economies, US, China, Germany. It'll be interesting to see what this looks like when it gets to Latin America and when it gets to South America, where I think we're already seeing a lot of the same signs of how traditional industries are now being challenged by this idea of arenas, or competitive and highly competitive arenas. But the good thing is we can actually see this quite early. We can, if we listen closely, and if we pay attention to what some call weak signals, you can actually see these elements quite early. You can look around you in your business context and we can make sense of what's happening. We can make sure to have what we call diverse views in top management. And we can, even if we don't have a burning platform, we can still try to encourage more critical thinking. We can try to be slightly more paranoid, with reference to only the paranoid survive. And we can really think differently in terms of how do we pay attention to what's happening in the landscape as opposed to within our comfortable business area. And I'd like to introduce, and this will be a pretty large part of the webinar, I'd like to introduce to you a tool that you can use for that purpose. So what I'd like to share with you is a strategy tool called the Industry Shifts Map, which is developed specifically to help companies make sense of how the world is changing around us. Now, this tool can be downloaded for free at strategytools.io. You can work with Roberto and Carlos and the team in Costa Rica to learn how to use this in practice. And Roberto, I know you've used this in many places, both in consulting and also education. I'm going to come back to your observations when we finish the case study. But I'm really looking forward to hearing your experiences and actually applying this with customers and students in the region. So the industry shifts map really starts with what are industry shifts? And we understand industry shifts as deep structural changes to how an industry operates. They also may take 10 years, but they're much more than just one single company. They affect all the companies in that industry space. So for example, digital medicine is something that affects not just doctors, but all the stakeholders in the medical system, from hospital, ambulances, pharmacies. So it's not a company issue, it's an industry issue. So what you want to do next is you want to have your participants brainstorm, discuss, and write down on Post-its or studies and list them in area number 2. Then you take those Post-its, which I'll show you a case study in a second, and you transfer them over here, where you have internal and external. And if you look at the x-axis here, external, so that means how powerful are the shifts that you are seeing in your industry today or in the very near future. So if you're looking at something that is extremely powerful, maybe even very disruptive, and I may use the coronavirus as an example, that's going to be very, very, very high. Now, on the other axis, the y-axis, the question is, how well can we respond? So what is our ability to listen, to learn, and to take strong positions based on these industry shifts? I don't know if any of you have paid attention to it, but the video conferencing software that we're using right now called Zoom, they quite early picked up on this coronavirus and said, use Zoom, reduce your travel, reduce your face-to-face meetings, and they were actually able to jump, and they are up almost 40% on the stock exchange recently because they were able to position themselves ahead of this quite disruptive industry shift. You then want to take your Post-its with you and place them into these categories, and I'll show you this with an example. And once you get into this category, you have 4 areas, 4 boxes: slow change, trouble, strong and stable, and future fit that you can look at. And I'll show you what that looks like in practice. I'll share with you a short Volkswagen case study. Now, I wanted to keep the same example as we had earlier, so we can get a good understanding from different perspectives on Volkswagen. So when we worked with Volkswagen, these are some of the elements that they said, these are things that we're seeing on the horizon. And these are not things that are specifically related to Volkswagen as a company. They are items and ideas and observations that are relevant to all the companies in our industry. And then we have to figure out company by company how we wish to solve them or at least address them. And as you can see in this example, there's a lot of different stuff. There's Tesla, which is specifically one competitor, or maybe a role model, if you will. There's electric cars. There's mobility companies like Uber, Lyft, and Grab. There's mobility as a service, which is more of a software element. But then there's also the changing consumer trend where fewer people actually want to own their own cars. And as you may have observed, there's a lot of people saying the last people to own a driving license has already been born, because there's now a decreasing interest from younger people, and there's most likely so much autonomous technology in the future that we're not going to need drivers and driving steering wheels. Cars will be technology on wheels. So the question then becomes, okay, well, what does all of these elements, what does all of these industry shifts actually mean to us? And you want to select, maybe you want to have a group, and maybe you want to have your executive team, maybe you want to have a broad number of people from across the organization. And you want to say, which of these are most important to us? Which of these matter most? Then you want to transfer them, and you want to transfer them over to the right-hand side, where it would look something like this. And here you see one observation of what are the power of these shifts. So you can see that most of these are very high to the right-hand side. So it means that they're very powerful for everyone in the industry. You also see that most of them are placed in the trouble category. What this means for Volkswagen was that they were able to see the changes. They were able to recognize the importance of electric cars. They were able to recognize the importance of smart mobility. They were able to recognize the impact of mobility as a service. But at the same time, they said that our ability to change is not strong enough for these shifts. This picture right here, this is now about 1.5 years ago, and a lot of things has happened in both axes. Volkswagen has been slowly creeping up on the y-axis, but also the power of these shifts have gone more to the right and only accelerated and strengthened. This is one tool called the Industry Shifts Map. And this is a tool that has been used successfully with probably hundreds of companies. I've personally run sessions from one single CEO, one-to-one, so we only have a two-person conversation, very enjoyable. And I've run this with hundreds of people in the room and 15 different groups working on this, all bringing their unique perspectives into the discussion. Roberto, I want to go back to you. Obviously, you know the region and you know the conditions on the ground in Latin America better than I do. But what has been some of your experiences using the Industry Shifts Map as a new strategy tool?
What has been very interesting, Chris, when we use Industry Shift is that usually organizations and people understand their external factors, let's say individually, but not necessarily they map it together and understand what is the relative position of the company regarding those external factors. So that's a little bit why earlier I was talking about the SWOT analysis, because people usually think about, okay, this is a threat, but not necessarily map how they, as a company, are exposed or are prepared to deal with that threat or take advantage of an opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's a good point, and I see many companies using this either to supplement the SWOT work, or actually in a lot of cases now also to replace the SWOT work, which also may be an option.
And if I may add, Chris, it also helps trigger a wider discussion in terms of companies asking themselves actually in what kind of business they are in and what kind of factors that maybe they haven't considered before might be affecting their potential future or become an opportunity to actually take advantage of.
Exactly, and that's the kind of attitude you need to successfully lead, and also to be a good champion, to be a good change agent, to be able to ask the right questions internally when facing with this. And that's what I'm going to show you a few examples of. And you said it really well, Roberto. This exercise and applying these kind of tools, you can really open some new questions to conversations. What business are we in today? And what business are we going to be in tomorrow and into the future? And increasingly, we find that the answer to those questions are something different from what we are today. Then the question is, well, how do we do that? How do we have a company that has a very successful business change and transform into something else? Well, there's a basic formula for this that we call 1 and 3. And it starts with defining your ambition. So what is your purpose, your mission, your vision, your overarching ambition that you want to reach? Then you can define your core business, your growth businesses, and your explore business. And maybe not all companies will have those. Some companies may be extremely core business focused. Some companies will be more growth focused, while some people and companies will also have a pretty strong balance between core growth and some crazy ideas in explore. And if we put that into the framing of yet another tool, it comes up with ambitions, core, growth, and explore. And to use the example of Volkswagen, Volkswagen has always been a car company. They have been focused on producing and selling cars. They sell more than 10 million cars every single year. Naturally, they focus on counting how many cars have we sold, what was the margins, and also what is the productivity and efficiency in our factories. And if you're a car company, that makes perfect sense. Now, most of you on this call would not be calling yourself a car company, but you would have something similar. You would have an ambition, you would have a core business, and you have some probably quite financially focused metrics or KPIs or targets for your core business. It can be total revenue, it can be profit margin, or it can be EBITDA as an example. The next area here, which we talked about, Roberto, is growth areas. What could be potentially very interesting, very exciting, and fairly realistic growth areas? So for Volkswagen, they viewed electric cars as growth area for many, many years. The market is very small, but they follow the market growth rate and see that it grows up year over year over year over year. They look at the improvements in charging time, and they of course look at the improvements of battery, both battery performance, but also battery cost. And as long as you can have battery cost coming down on a radical pace and battery performance going up, you know that it's only a question before you reach a significant tipping point and electric cars becomes the dominant standard type of car. Then you also have this explore category. And the big question is, should a big company like Volkswagen get into this radical innovation? Should a company like Volkswagen spend time, money, and resources on entirely new technologies and opportunities? So most of us, including myself, would say absolutely. It is critical for a company to focus on its core business, to focus some of its resources on the growth areas, but also make sure that you focus enough time, people's attention on the explore areas. Now, in this case, Volkswagen could say, yeah, we should focus on autonomous cars and we should aim to be one of the world's leaders in autonomous cars. But it doesn't make sense to count cars sold and margins because it's too early. It's just not developed yet. So instead, you want to say, okay, well, how many different partners do we have exclusively for autonomous cars? That's an indication of success. How many other companies want to join this work? How many startups have we invested in? And for a company like Volkswagen to really build out autonomous cars, you can easily imagine that they need to acquire between 20 and 100 companies, acquire and integrate. So finally, a KPI here would be how many companies have we bought? How many companies have we bought in the last 12 months to realize, to execute our autonomous car strategy? So this is the core, growth, and explore framework. This is a framework that's being used now by hundreds and hundreds of companies to work differently on strategy, to make sure that we can have a visual, clean, simple representation of our traditional core business, where most of our revenue comes from, our strong opportunity growth areas, and also our long shots, or what some would call moon shots, in explore categories. And I don't know about your experiences, Roberto, but how many companies in Costa Rica would you say have this framework really well developed?
We don't find many, definitely. I would say that there are a lot that are considering growth areas, natural adjacencies, but you really don't engage in discussions about going beyond those natural and easily fit kind of investments. So yeah, this is uncharted territory for many organizations.
And I think that is really the key. when we look at many of these successful transformation cases, they've all followed this process. Some of them did it knowingly, some of them did it by accident, some of them had a plan, some of them it just happened organically and naturally. But this is really the background, if you will, for many of the successful transformation cases that we see. And we advise companies around the world that this, at a very basic level, should be the foundational thinking for your strategy. When we look at a company like Volkswagen, you know, we know and they know that they need to change, they need to transform into something else. So long term, it's not about selling cars, it's about being a globally leading mobility company. And they're going to have to do so much new things in both growth and explore. We're going to see in 10 years time, 7 years time, we're going to see a very different company that we used to know as Volkswagen in the future. Now, if we go a little bit deeper into this, if we go a little bit deeper and we really dig into, well, what does that take? What does it take to successfully transform a big company, a big, successful, established company? So in our research and in our work over the last years, we find 10 principles. And those 10 principles is really your step-by-step roadmap for you to lead a successful transformation. And we can split them into sort of 3 main groups. The first 3 areas, the first 3 principles is really to understand what's happening around you. So sensing your landscape. And we find that many companies have very little time, attention, and focus on this external shifting landscape. And then we have what we call building the operation and really pulling all of these pieces together. You have to create a transformational architecture, develop an innovation strategy, business model innovation portfolio, mastering corporate venture. And then when you've done most of that work, and this is work that can take a couple of years for very large companies, it's work that can take 6 months for very agile companies. When you've been sensing, you've been building, then you want to sort of integrate it into your operations. You want to build new capabilities. You want to put up very different business cases and investment models. And then you realize when you've been through the first 9 steps of these 10 principles, you realize this is not a one-time thing. This becomes a repetitive thing. And your future competitive advantage comes not from doing this once, but being able to do it again and again and again. So Roberto, these 10 principles of transformation, I think that's something that we now see is very important. We see more and more companies paying attention. We have people from even just today from Asia, from Canada, from Europe, reaching out to. So I think these 10 principles of transformation is going to be very important also for companies in Costa Rica and Latin America to really understand and say, how does that fit for us and what can we do in this space? What are your observations here?
Yeah, it's very interesting, Chris, because when we talk to clients, they might be thinking about a couple of these areas, but there are some of them that they really haven't even considered at all. Like, for example, the ecosystem elements. They're trying to figure out, you know, what's their relationship to an ecosystem, because ecosystems are usually thought in the context of startups, for example, or entrepreneurs. And so you see the pieces, but you don't see yet someone putting them together. So I would say that the most advanced companies will probably have 4 of these in place.
No. And you know that's the starting point. But I think that we're going to see many more companies realize that it really makes sense for us to have an overarching framework to actually build a strong roadmap for this. And of course, you're not going to have all of these principles in place on day number 1. You may have some, but to pull this together, That's something that we think is really important. And we talk about this in the report as the transformation roadmap. And there's an extensive work that's coming around that. And I would really recommend people that are interested to have a conversation with Roberto or Carlos to see how we can make this happen in Costa Rica. It's going to be very important for companies to master these 10 principles.
Chris, there is an interesting question here regarding the strategy intro model. How do you approach from a public organization the explore side when they're bounded to certain regulations?
So I think that's a really good question. I've seen many public organizations apply the same framework, and I would actually say that it really comes down to the people and the leadership. So innovative people in public organizations, they will always find a way. It's not necessarily easy, but it's not easy in private companies either. But innovative people will always find a way. Now, when I work with them, I say, yes, there's a risk that you can get fired for doing this. That's a real life risk. But if you really believe in this, and if you really, at the deepest level of your heart, think this is important enough, then follow it and see what happens. And every time I've been involved both with the municipalities and also national innovation agencies, they've taken big risk, but it always pays off. It always pays off.
Okay, so we're welcoming questions. I do have one that I've gotten a couple times, Chris, is if you're a company and you're facing a shift scenario, you're kind of late understanding the kind of shifts that are going to impact your business, and you start to see new players bringing new business models, and you're a company that has already made some significant investments. If you're in retail and you have the warehouses and the stores, how you address that kind of realities, and how can you get into a transformation mindset when most of the business models that people are talking about, it's more relevant to have access, for example, to the assets than really owning the assets.
So that's a great question, Roberto, and it's a difficult one because from a financial point of view, it always made sense for companies to own the assets, to own the hotels and the buildings and the cars and the planes, and then increasingly we started offloading balance sheets, and we're able to leverage balance sheets quite differently. And of course, what we're seeing today is that many companies are building platforms where the platform own the customer relationship, the platform own the customer interaction, and what we call also the control of the customer. But the assets are distributed out in the case of Airbnb for hotels or Uber for cars. So it's a good question with no easy answer to pay attention to.
And Chris, following up on the same path, what's your experience, working with companies globally, in terms of what is holding companies back to really start and kick off, such a deep transformation? It's about leadership. It's about not having the right frameworks and tools, about skills. What are your thoughts regarding that aspect?
So that's a really difficult question. It's also a question that we cover in the report because we recognize that it is incredibly important. So what we find is that it's really a combination of things. Number one is leadership, but not just the CEO type leadership. It's really, do you have a a transformational leadership in place at the board level? Do you have it in place at the management level, so the CEO and the C-suite? And do you also have it in place at the strategy function, which may also be the business unit level? Because if the answer is no, 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 then nothing is going to happen. If the answer is yes, 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 you're in a completely different space. And that, of course, opens the question, well, what does transformational leadership mean? First of all, it means a large degree of external orientation. So you need to be curious. You need to pay attention to what's happening. And you need to really understand that those things that are happening, maybe they don't matter to us today, but if they play out, what could happen to these elements? And I think that's really, really important.
It's very interesting and fascinating. We're pretty much about to run out of time, Chris. It has been really interesting to see, how much, let's say, how to approach strategy has changed. We kind of the old guys that have had the opportunity to get training in the traditionals and classicals, as Carlos is saying, is quite fascinating when you get tools that are methodologies and a way of thinking that really fits towards the kind of dilemmas that companies are facing today. Any last sneak peek that you want to give us regarding the upcoming report of the transformational company as a closing remark?
Well, I think the message is for everyone that how we think about strategy today is changing. How we think about strategies in big companies need to change much faster. And in the next 10 years, we're going to see billions and billions and billions of shareholder value destroyed unless companies learn how to build transformational companies. And I think that challenge is important for governments, for innovation clusters, for business schools, and of course, executives and future leaders at all levels. So like you're showing here, Roberto, people can register for the report, and the report's going to be out on March 10. And I really encourage people to have conversations with Roberto and Carlos and others, because this is really important, that we have to build more transformational companies for the future.
So we are very grateful for your time. I think it's getting close to evening in Norway, so enjoy the rest of the night. And switching to Spanish here, para nuestra audiencia en Latinoamérica, ha sido un placer tener a Cristian compartiendo sus experiencias, su enfoque de cómo trabajamos en Engage, Innovate y en Strategy Tools, en estos nuevos retos, posiblemente el reto de la transformación estratégica, el más grande que enfrentan hoy los líderes de las organizaciones. Y no duden en comunicarse con nosotros, ahí está el correo al que nos pueden escribir. Manténganse atentos a las novedades en cuanto a las diferentes actividades que estaremos llevando a cabo a lo largo de la región. Y pues bueno, muchas gracias por haberse unido al webinar. Esperamos que hayan encontrado estos insights interesantes. Nos encantaría poder conversar con ustedes más en detalle, así que no duden en comunicarse con nosotros. Again, Chris, thank you. We hope you're practicing your Spanish, as I'm sure we'll see you around here very soon.
I'm looking forward to it, and muchas gracias para todos.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. Bye.
Thank you. Ciao.
Hasta luego a todos.